I know you take good care of Meadow, Paul's daughter.
She takes good care of me. To see her with my children is one of the most beautiful things.
There are friendships that exist for convenience, and then there are friendships that rewrite a person from the inside out. The kind where two people meet and something shifts permanently, where the world before that meeting feels incomplete in hindsight. Paul Walker and Vin Diesel had that kind of friendship. It was forged on a film set in 2000, tempered through years of sequels and late-night conversations, and ultimately tested by the most brutal kind of loss imaginable. When Paul died in November 2013, everyone who loved him was left scrambling to make sense of a world he was no longer part of. But one person, more than almost anyone else, had to figure out how to keep living inside that grief while also being a source of strength for someone else. That person was Vin Diesel. And the someone else was Meadow Walker, Paul's daughter, who was only 15 years old when her father's car went off a road in Valencia, California, and everything changed. For years, the public watched from a distance. They saw Instagram posts and red carpet appearances. They saw Vin walk Meadow down the aisle at her 2021 wedding. They saw her brief cameo in Fast X. They constructed narratives from fragments, some of them warm and admiring, others suspicious and unkind. Rumors circulated. People questioned motives. The internet, as it tends to do, took a beautiful and complicated human story and tried to flatten it into something scandalous. But Meadow Walker, who inherited her father's quiet dignity along with his eyes, never rushed to correct the record. She let the noise run its course. And then, slowly and on her own terms, she began to speak. What she revealed wasn't a dark secret in the way tabloids meant the phrase. It was something far more interesting than that. It was the truth. Paul Walker was not a man who needed the spotlight to feel validated. That much was obvious to anyone who paid close attention to the gap between his public image and his actual life choices. Born on September 12, 1973, in Glendale, California, Paul William Walker IV grew up in a large, tightly knit Mormon household with 4 siblings and a father who had once been a competitive boxer. His mother, Cheryl, had modeled professionally, and perhaps that early exposure to performance planted some seed, because Paul found his way in front of cameras before he could even form a coherent sentence. His first appearances were in commercials as a toddler, and by his teenage years he had accumulated small roles in television productions including Charles in Charge and Highway to Heaven. But the acting was almost incidental. Paul's deeper passions ran toward the ocean, toward engines, toward anything that connected him to the physical world rather than the manufactured one. His love for marine biology was genuine and sustained. He studied it in community college and never really let it go. In 2006, he participated in a National Geographic expedition focused on great white sharks off the coast of Mexico, helping researchers tag the animals in open water. He spoke about that experience with more visible excitement than he brought to most interviews about his films. He co-owned a car preparation and racing business called Always Evolving, and his involvement there was hands-on in the most literal sense, not a celebrity vanity investment but a real working operation where Paul spent hours doing what he loved. His personal car collection reportedly exceeded 30 vehicles at the time of his death, and it included a Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 that matched almost exactly the car his Fast and Furious character drove on screen. For Paul, the movies and the real life were continuous. He wasn't performing a version of himself. He was himself. His daughter Meadow was born in 1998. Her mother, Rebecca Soteros, raised her primarily in Hawaii through Meadow's early childhood, and for years father and daughter navigated the geography of a divided family across long distances. But when Meadow was 13, she made a choice that said everything about how she felt about her father. She moved to California to live with him. Paul, by multiple accounts, reorganized his life around that decision. He has been quoted describing the ability to make breakfast for his daughter every morning as one of the defining satisfactions of his adult life. He was in discussions with his representatives about stepping back from the relentless pace of franchise filmmaking to create more space for time with Meadow. The accident on November 30, 2013, made those discussions irrelevant. Paul was 40 years old. Vin Diesel, born Mark Sinclair on July 18, 1967, had known Paul for 13 years by the time of the crash. Their friendship began on the set of the original Fast and the Furious and deepened through the shared experience of building something together over multiple films spanning more than a decade. They were genuinely different people in many ways, different backgrounds, different temperaments, different approaches to public life. But they held the same values in the places that mattered. Family loyalty. Privacy as a form of respect. Fatherhood as the most serious work a man could do. Vin has spoken about how watching Paul with Meadow shaped his own understanding of what being a father could look like. When Vin's daughter Pauline was born, he named her after Paul. He has described standing in the delivery room and thinking of his friend. The depth of that tribute is not the kind of thing people manufacture. When Paul died, Vin was photographed at the funeral looking like a man carrying something much heavier than grief. He gave a eulogy. He wore dark glasses. He barely held himself together in public and reportedly allowed himself to fall apart in private. But within the fog of that loss, he made a decision that would define the years that followed. He reached out to Meadow. Not in a grand gesture, not with press releases or publicists, but in a small consistent way that actual care expresses itself. He called. He visited. He included her in the life of his own family. His children, Hania, Vincent, and Pauline, grew up knowing Meadow as something close to a sibling. Vin referred to her publicly as his goddaughter, but the texture of the relationship was something more improvised and more genuine than that label suggests. It was built day by day out of shared loss and shared commitment to honoring the person they had both loved. The public, particularly the portion of it that lives on social media and YouTube comment sections, did not always receive this gracefully. When Meadow appeared for a few seconds as a flight attendant in Fast X in 2023, the reaction split almost immediately. Many fans were moved. They saw a young woman stepping briefly into the world her father had inhabited, and they felt the weight of that gesture. Others were less generous. Critics accused the filmmakers of emotional manipulation, of using Paul Walker's legacy as a marketing tool. Questions were raised about whether Meadow earned the appearance on its own merits or whether her last name was doing most of the work. The adoption rumor resurfaced, suggesting that Vin had formally adopted Meadow after Paul's death. There was no legal record to support this claim, and those close to the situation gave no indication it was accurate. Meadow continued to use Walker as her surname. But the rumor spread anyway, because the internet rarely lets facts interrupt a compelling story. Then there were the darker insinuations. The suggestion that Vin's public warmth toward Meadow was calculated, that he was performing grief and guardianship for an audience, that his closeness to Paul's daughter served his own image more than her actual needs. These theories circulated through the same channels where everything circulates now, gaining traction through repetition rather than evidence. And Meadow watched all of it from a careful distance. She did not log on to correct the record. She did not issue statements through her representatives. She continued building the Paul Walker Foundation, which her father had established after witnessing the aftermath of the 2010 Haiti earthquake, and which remains active in disaster relief and ocean conservation. She developed her modeling career. She settled into married life with Louis Thornton, whom she wed in an intimate beach ceremony in the Dominican Republic with Vin beside her and Hania Sinclair as her chief bridesmaid. What Meadow eventually shared, in posts and in the rare interviews she granted, was not revelatory in the sensational sense the internet craved. It was revelatory in a quieter and more lasting way. She described Vin as someone who had simply been present, consistently and without agenda, through the years when presence was the only thing that mattered. She posted photographs of herself with his children captioned with the word family, not as a hashtag but as a statement. She described her cameo in Fast X as her own idea, not a studio decision, something she chose because she wanted to inhabit for a moment the universe that had meant so much to her father. She made clear that the bond between her and Vin was not a performance for the franchise's benefit. It was the residue of a genuine friendship that had predated any of the films they would eventually promote together. Paul's brother Cody Walker has spoken similarly. He has expressed gratitude toward Vin for the consistency of his support, and Cody himself has continued stewarding his brother's legacy through both Reach Out Worldwide and FuelFest, an international automotive event that honors Paul's memory while raising money for charitable causes. As of recent years, Reach Out Worldwide have responded to more than 70 major disaster situations, deploying skilled volunteers into situations where institutional response often arrives too slowly. Paul had founded the organization because he believed that people with practical skills should show up and use them. That philosophy has outlived him. The so-called dark secret that promised to explain the years of speculation turned out to be something simpler and in some ways harder to dramatize than anything the rumor cycle had imagined. There was no secret. There was a man who lost his best friend too early and decided that the way to honor that friendship was to be genuinely present for the 15-year-old girl who had lost her father. There was a young woman who grew up in the shadow of enormous grief and chose, carefully and deliberately, to carry her father's memory forward without being consumed by it. There was a relationship built on loss that became something that actually looked, in its daily textures, like family. Vin Diesel is not a simple person to understand from the outside. He guards his private life aggressively. His long-term partner Paloma Jimenez and their 3 children are kept largely away from public scrutiny. He is capable of enormous public sentiment and simultaneously very careful about what he actually reveals. He has never fully explained what Paul Walker meant to him in terms that feel sufficient, because the terms probably don't exist. He named his daughter after him. He walked Meadow down the aisle at her wedding. He posts tributes on Paul's birthday every year without apparent concern for whether anyone finds it repetitive. These are not the actions of a man performing emotion. They are the actions of a man who is still, a decade later, working through the loss of someone irreplaceable. Meadow Walker is 26 years old. She is building a life that is recognizably her own, separate from the franchise, separate from the mythology. She carries her father's name and supports his foundation and made one quiet cameo in one of his movies and then returned to the life she is constructing for herself. The noise that surrounded her in 2023 has not visibly altered her course. She moves with the kind of self-possession that suggests she understood from a young age that she could not control what people said about her, only what she chose to do. That is, in its way, exactly what Paul Walker modeled for her in the years they had together. Protect your private life. Do the work that matters. Show up for the people you love. Let everything else be noise. The real story of Vin Diesel and Meadow Walker is not a scandal. It is something rarer and less entertaining to the parts of the internet that require conflict to sustain attention. It is a story about 2 people navigating grief together and arriving, years later, at something that functions like family. It is a story about a man keeping a promise to someone who was no longer alive to hold him to it. And it is a story about a daughter who watched all of this, who saw clearly what was real and what was fabricated, and who chose, when she finally spoke, to tell the truth rather than the version that would generate the most clicks. In the end, that choice says everything about who raised her,